Now let's move on to the central nervous system. So that is like one of the most important parts in our human body. So it is important in controlling of all the activities in our body and also in coordination. So the brain and the spinal cord belongs to the central nervous system. Now let's look at the parts that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord and therefore protecting the brain and spinal cord. Right. Now there's the skull that provides protection to the brain. The skull is found around our brain. And then there's the vertebral column. A skull will protect our brain, and then the vertebral column will protect the spinal cord. Right. Other than that, there are other protective layers as well. Inside the skull and the vertebral column, there's a thing called meninges. Right? So meninges are found underneath the skull around the brain and underneath the vertebral column around the spinal cord. Right. Now let's look at what meninges are. Meninges is basically a kind of a membrane. Okay, children, now here's a diagram of the meninges found inside our skull. You know this part you see? Now this is the skull that surrounds our brain, and then underneath it, from this point to this point, this entire thing is known as the meninges, right? So it is made up of 3 layers. As you can see, there are 3 layers. You don't have to know about these layers separately. Just know that these are made up of cells. They are made up of fibrous cells. So they kind of form like a cushion-like membrane around the brain. And you should also notice, now here's the first layer and here's the second layer. And between the second layer and the third layer, there is a space in between. Here's a space, right? Right. And this space is filled up with the fluid, right? Now we'll be learning about that. So there's a special type of a fluid which is found within the cavities of the brain and between the meninges, between the 2 places that I showed you, between the 2 layers of meninges, the second layer and the third layer, there's a space, and that space is filled up by this fluid. And also there are cavities inside our brain, and these spaces are also filled up by this fluid, and that fluid is known as the cerebrospinal fluid. So there are certain functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Let's look at them. They support brain and the spinal cord. They support the brain and the spinal cord, and they absorb shocks and jerks, right? So basically what it does, it protects the brain, right? So if there is a hard blow aimed at your head, so it has the ability to absorb shocks and jerks that's happening to your head in order to protect the brain from any of it. And then protection against microbial infections and diseases, right? And then nourishing the tissues which is found in the brain, right? So these are the 4 major functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. And now we are moving on to the brain. Now here, brain is protected by the cranium. Now what is this cranium? As I have told you earlier, the brain is found inside the skull. It's found inside the skull, but this cranium is the part of the skull which consists of the bones enclosing the brain, but it does not include the bones of the face or jaw. Now let's have a look at the image of a cranium. Now here's an image of the cranium. As you can see, this entire thing is known as the skull, but these colored areas, which are the bones which covers the brain, there are 8 cranial bones. This part is known as the cranium. Face and the jaw bones do not include into the cranium, right? And then of course it is surrounded by 3 linings called the meninges, which are made up of fibrous cells, as I told earlier. And there are about millions of neurons that make up the brain, right? Okay. Other than neurons, there are also another type of a accessory cell called neuroglia. There are many neuroglia in the brain. So this is a neuron, this part, this orange color thing, and then surrounding it, you can find a few neuroglia cells. Here they have given some names: astrocytes, oligodendrocytes. So these are neuroglial cells. So what does the neuroglial cell actually do? Well, they do several functions. They maintain homeostasis. They form myelin. Myelin, you know, the lipid that is found around the axons of the neuron. And then they provide support and protection for neurons. Now let's look at the parts of the brain. Here you get the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. And then you get the cerebellum. And then you get the medulla oblongata. So, okay, children, so we are going to learn about a lot of new terms and more new terms coming up. There are things called gray matter and white matter that makes up the brains. Okay, now let's look at what is gray matter and what is white matter. Okay, so here's a cross section of the brain, the diagram of the brain, and in here the gray matter and white matter are indicated clearly. So as you can see, the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, has two kinds of tissues, the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter, it has a pinkish gray color in the living brain. It can be seen in the form of a pinkish gray color in the living brain, whereas the white matter area in which white matter are found, you can see a whitish color, right? So gray matter, this area called gray matter, contains the cell bodies of the neurons, the dendrites, and the axon terminals of the neurons, right? So that area is found in the form of a pinkish gray color, whereas white matter is made up of axons. And why do you think it's seen in the form of a white color? The reason is, around the axon, I have told you, it has myelinated sheath, right? Myelin sheath is kind of a lipid or fat, right? So because of that, white matter is whitish and the gray matter is kind of gray, right? So in the brain, the periphery or the surrounding, you know what the periphery is, right? The peripheral area of the brain is made up of gray matter, while the interior part is made up of white matter. So the gray matter majorly contains cell bodies, whereas white matter contains the axons. Okay, now we will be discussing about each part of the brain, and first let's talk about the cerebrum. So cerebrum is the largest and the most highly developed part of the brain, right? As you all know, in the previous diagram you would have seen that it is divided into two parts, as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And as you can see in this diagram, the cortex of the cerebrum is highly convoluted. So what could be the reason? Obviously, to increase the surface area so that a large number of neurons can be occupied, right? Okay, so the left, so how does the cerebrum usually function? You would have known that the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right half of the body, while the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left part of the body. Here, there you go, I have highlighted it. Right, now let's move on to the functions of the cerebrum. As you all know, this is like the major part of the brain. So perception of impulses from receptors. So what are the receptors? Receptors are the sensory organs, so you perceive impulses from them. And then identification of received sensory information and storage of those information. So this entire coordination thing is kind of like passing a message from the sensory organs to the central nervous system, and from the central nervous system back to the effectors, which is going to be a muscle or a gland. Okay, so a response is produced, right? So the major function of the cerebrum is perception of impulses which are created from the receptors, and then they are identified, and then once you receive these sensory information, they are stored in order to decide what could be the response, right? And then perception of senses about pain, vision, temperature, taste, and smell. As you can see, these are the senses that are perceived by the sensory organs. So this perception is majorly done by cerebrum, right? And then perform high mental activities such as learning, intelligence, and thinking. So remember, the largest part of the brain is what performs high mental activities. And then controlling of voluntary muscle contraction. Now, what are voluntary muscles? As you have learned, there are three types of muscle tissues: skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Out of these three tissues, only one tissue will act voluntarily, right? And that is skeletal muscles, right? So controlling of skeletal or voluntary muscle contractions is done by cerebrum, right? Now we move on to cerebellum. Now let's talk about the cerebellum. So it is located just below the cerebrum. It also consists of two hemispheres, and just like in the cerebrum, gray matter is found in the periphery or outer layer, while the white matter is found inside the interior. It's the interior layer, right? Okay. So what are the functions of cerebellum? Maintenance of body balance, control of voluntary muscle activity or skeletal muscle activity, and involved in maintenance of body movement. Now let's talk about medulla oblongata. In that, it is located interior to the cerebellum but anteriorly, which means in front. Have a look at the location of medulla oblongata. As you can see, it is found interior to the cerebellum but anteriorly, which means in front. This part, anterior to the cerebellum. It is the important center which controls many life processes which involve involuntary actions. By now you know the difference between voluntary and involuntary. So let's look at the functions of medulla oblongata. They control the rate of heartbeat, they control the rate of respiration, and then they control reflex actions such as vomiting, coughing, and swallowing. Now we'll be learning about reflex actions. For the moment, just understand reflex actions are things that happen involuntarily.